Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I am Dr. Amanda Shee. I'm an anesthesiologist and intensivist, and today I want to talk to you guys about some interview tips, tricks, things from my experience going through residency interviews as well as being a residency interviewer myself. So hopefully this will be everything you kind of need for being successful in Match 2025. My caveat, of course, is that I can only speak to my own experiences as a medical student that had applied into anesthesia. And then obviously the other caveat is I've only had the experience of virtual interviews as an interviewer and not an interviewee. But I've certainly talked to a lot of my residents and talked to a lot of my mentees about the experience. And there's actually some literature that has come out about whether the virtual interview process is enough to get to know a program. And it looks like it definitely is enough to get to know a program. A lot of residents realize when they get to their program that even with not being able to physically go there to interview, they actually do get a good feel for what the program represents and what to expect once they had gotten there. Of course, there's a bit more of a transitional period if you have never been to a city before and you're going there for the first time when you're moving there. But that being said, the goal of this video is not to focus on that piece. If you want more on some of that, feel free to ask questions in the comments and hopefully I can follow up with another video. Maybe I'll do a Q&A at some point, we'll see. But let's get right into some of the interview tips and things that I've been thinking of to make sure that you are successful this match season. So before starting this video, I looked into Reddit and online forums about what are some of the questions that people had gotten in the recent residency interview seasons. And one of the ones that came up that people kept saying really tripped them up was, what questions do you have for me? I don't feel like this should be something that trips you up because as an interviewer, I want to see that you have actually looked into the program and that you're serious about a program. So if you're serious about a program and you're about to literally move there for a minimum of 3 years, then I would expect that you would have some questions about it, especially since residency is such a huge part of your life for those few years that you're going to be spending a lot of time with, especially in anesthesia, you're going to be spending a lot of time with the attendings, you're going to be spending a lot of time at the hospital. There are a lot of questions that you should be coming into an interview with, ready to ask, because if you've researched that program and you are interested in it, you should be pretending, okay, if I actually matched here, what is it that I would want to know about my life here? So be prepared. Number one, for that question, what questions do you as the interviewee have for me as the interviewer? That's something too I was gonna highlight was one of the things I did if I was able to get my interview schedule ahead of time and I had the names of the interviewers I was gonna be with, I actually looked up very specific things about each of my interviewers, so that can help with that question too. I usually also ask some more generic things. I mean, in general, I'd say that it looks a lot more slick when you know something about your interviewer. So if you have the chance to look someone up and you know that they're obsessed with X, Y, or Z research thing, or if you're interviewing with me and you're like, hey, I actually watched some of your videos or read your blog, they were super helpful, and then launch into some question about that. How are you able to do medicine and be able to keep up a social media practice? What are your thoughts on X, Y, or Z things? And then maybe tie it to the program. Oh, I see that you stayed on at Mass General, even though you never expected to stay on. What kept you there? These are some of the types of questions you can ask, especially if you've kind of looked someone up, to be able to really tie it to that interviewer that you have and make it more interesting for the interviewer as well. The other piece is it really demonstrates kind of just a human interest period, right? So coming to an interview and not being excited or interested in getting to know the person that you're interviewing with, who again will probably be your attending if you match there, or the surrounding areas, like even asking about that, there can be a million questions that you come in ready to ask questions about. So absolutely be prepared for that question of what questions do you have for me. The second piece of advice I wanted to highlight was that a lot of us as interviewers love to look at the hobby section. I think that this is interesting when I go through all the Reddit kind of conversations about how many people are like, oh, they asked me about my hobbies. Honestly, yes. So one thing I'll say is that residency interviews certainly are a lot more casual than medical school interviews. So I felt like my medical school interviews were like super high stress. They were really, really stiff. They were really, really professional. I mean, I don't know if that's really the right way of saying that, but they just didn't feel like a conversation. They felt like an interview. They felt high pressure. They felt set up that way. Whereas residency interviews are totally not, most of the time, set up that way. The point of residency interviews is to figure out if you are a good match for that program and if that program is a good match for you. So it is a match process, which, by the way, make sure you watch the video about the match algorithm. It is super confusing to figure out, but there's a lot of good videos that explain how the match process works. Ultimately, it works in the student's favors. So just keep that in mind. It's like you are the one that has the upper hand here. This isn't like medical school where they're like, oh, you know, we get to choose our class, period, and that's that. Like, you do your interview and that's that. With the match, it actually means that if you are high on their list and you rank them really high, you're gonna get that. That's what happens. So it's a really interesting thing about the whole match, but just look into that because I think it's really important to go into this process realizing that you're interviewing the program too. You're definitely, in medical school, I think that because you end up having pretty limited choices depending on what kind of applicant you are, et cetera, that it feels like the medical school has more of an upper hand. And I feel like with residency, yes, for the match piece, it feels very unsettling that you don't know where you're gonna end up. And one day you're just gonna know, oh, I could live across the country where I don't know anyone and I'm gonna be at X program where I was like, oh, I'm not really sure about this. Yes, that part is certainly unsettling. But at the end of the day, a big part of this is also you figuring out which program would make you most successful. So that's something I really wanted to highlight too about this, is like, this is a casual enough thing where the interview process should be more of a conversation rather than me grilling a applicant with a bajillion questions. It should be kind of like a go back and forth type of thing. There absolutely will be questions. I will get to that in a few minutes, but make sure that you kind of go into this realizing that this is a interview to figure out if you guys are a good fit for each other. You for the program, program for you. So definitely think about your hobbies section and how you want to share some of those hobbies. So I've seen a lot of different hobbies sections that have included things like, I think I've included weightlifting and social media in mine, and I think everyone asked me about weightlifting, which I thought was kind of interesting, but at the same time I was like, well, I put it in there, so obviously it's something that's gonna be asked. And at the time what I was doing some more of the power lift, so it was really something that I think it was interesting to people, was like, oh, really? That, like, how'd you get into that? Why do you still do it? How does it make you feel? And I was able to kind of go into that. And obviously the other piece is at that time, social media was not as well accepted in the medical community. So I put some social media stuff on there and I did talk about it, but it definitely wasn't a heavy part of my application at that time. So that being said, like, it's something where just be prepared to answer questions about your hobby section and be genuine about some of those things. Be ready to talk about what excites you. Like, the other big thing that I noticed when I am interviewing applicants is whether this is something that really excites you and you end up kind of showing in your body language or showing in the way you talk about something that you care about it and you are excited to be able to teach me about it so I can learn more. So hobby section, very important. The third piece of advice that I wanted to go over was just really knowing every single letter of your ERAS application really well. Okay, so I mean like every letter, not like your letters of recommendation, but like every single word that you put into ERAS, you should know really well. I say this mostly because you never know what part of your application that your interviewer is going to be excited about. So one of the things that I'll do is, like, I will, as an interview and I'm preparing for someone's interview, I'll go through their application, I'll read through their personal statement, and I'll go through all their experiences and figure out which of those experiences resonates with me and makes me really excited so that I can ask them specific questions about it, or if I personally had experience in that area. So one example of that is, I remember I'd interviewed someone where they had listed something about AMLA, which is the American Medical Women's Association. And for those of you who didn't follow along with my blog, I had spent well over a decade since medical school working with the American Medical Women's Association in various leadership roles, as well as on their board of directors, as well as running their conferences. So it was a very big part of my life. So anyone who had put that on their application, I would ask about their experience with that because it was something I knew really, really well. So you can really tell if someone had only spent like 2 hours doing this type of thing, or someone had poured their like heart and soul into a particular organization or event, or what have you, that type of thing, by asking about it. So sometimes I think that I'll see some experiences that are not so significant in some ways, but I would still ask about it just because it's something, if it's something that is interesting to me, I can ask more questions about it. And it is a more genuine of a conversation when that's the case. So I find that I really like those types of things. And for you as the interviewee, it's so important that you are ready to be able to explain what that experience was, what it meant to you, and kind of just give me an idea of how that has influenced you to be the person that you kind of are today and what you're going to bring to the residency program as a result of that. So not every single experience is going to have some major impact on who you are and things like that, but it should be pretty obvious that you actually did the thing that you put on there. You know, I just want to know that this isn't some fluff and that you can talk about this experience. The fourth thing that I wanted to highlight too was that in your application, you should have been able to curate some sort of brand or some sort of message that you want to get across about who you are as a candidate for that residency program. So what I would give you an example of is when I was applying to residency, I really leaned hard on two components of my application. One was that I had significant leadership within the American Medical Women's Association. The second part was that I had a pretty non-traditional route. So for those of you guys who don't know, I dropped out of high school early. I literally don't have a high school diploma. That's real life. That's my fun fact thing, by the way. I don't have a high school diploma. I went to college early. I transferred to another place. I have engineering degrees. I worked as an engineer for a few months, and then I went to a brand new medical school. Like, let's talk about non-traditional. That's 100% my route. And the other thing I leaned hard on in the non-traditional sense was that I had a social media presence. And back then, that was not common. And that was something that I also could tie into those two components of leadership with American Medical Women's Association and then non-traditional. So think about maybe 2 to 3 type of themes that you're trying to get across of you as a candidate for a program, and figure out when you're practicing your interview responses, how you're going to work those themes into the interview and being able to make it feel like a full circle, like, oh, I'm actually getting to know you off of the paper, you in 3 dimensions, well, I guess 2 dimensions on Zoom. But anyway, you as a person instead of just you as ink on paper, or I guess on a screen nowadays. I mean, I don't know. I really still like printed things. I feel like I'm an old person now because I still love my printed things, but I'm going on tangents. So think about kind of how you can distill down your application into a couple themes and bring that with you to answering the questions. So the fifth part that I wanted to go over was getting into some of the actual interview questions. So I would say that there's kind of 2 components or 2 groupings of interview questions that generally come up. So one is just the traditional interview questions that you're probably going to get at the vast majority of the programs you're going to go to and interview at, which is, tell me about yourself. Hence, this is an opportunity to practice like an elevator pitch. So if you ever just Google how you're going to be able to curate an elevator pitch, it's something that's succinct but really highlights the main points of who you are. And you can practice that and you can make it so that you really are comfortable sharing this about yourself and comfortable doing it right off the top of your head. Why X program? So why do you want to come to MGH? Why do you want to be X specialist? So why do you want to be an anesthesiologist in my case? I talked about earlier the hobby section, so that all generally comes up at some point during the interview. Other things too that can come up is asking an applicant about what the interviewer can learn about you that's not obvious from your application. And then something I oftentimes want to know about too is, where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years or after you graduate from residency? It's kind of the question of trying to figure out, what kind of practice do you want to be in? Are you academic focused? Are you private practice focused? Are you looking at a research career? Are you looking at a mixed situation? How are you thinking about fellowships already? Things like that are kind of on my mind when I ask that question. But remember, anytime you answer one of those questions about the future, about things that you're interested in, you're not absolutely tied into, you're not like, we're not gonna like record that interview and say, wow, you said in your interview that you want to do critical care and now you suddenly want to do chronic pain, like WTF. Like, that's not the point of the interview. It's just to see what direction you're thinking of going in and kind of why. things change in life and all of us recognize that. And the other piece I'd say is there's plenty of residents I've worked with that come in thinking that they're going to do one subspecialty and they end up doing a completely different fellowship. That's okay. So don't worry about what you say at your interview. That shouldn't influence what you do with the rest of your life. Ultimately, it is your life. So you need to make sure to do what is best for you. The other grouping of types of questions that I really want to highlight too is that at some point during your process, you will get asked behavioral questions. Now, these are the types of questions that more of the medical school interview setting we'll see. So you probably have encountered these before, but it's been like 4 years since you interviewed for medical school. So it's probably a little rusty in your mind. So I think it's important to go over some of the types of behavioral questions that can come up and some of the ways that I kind of think about them. So one of the behavioral questions, tell me about a time you failed. How did you deal with that situation? For me, one of the responses I would go over is actually that I failed a medical school exam. And I actually wrote an entire blog entry about it. So if I was preparing for this question, I would look through my blog entry. Also, if you kept a journal, this is kind of helpful to kind of think about, oh, you know, what happened in my life and how can I be able to use that information, especially if it's something that's not written in your application, or if it is written in your application, that's totally fine. But hearing it in real life rather than reading it is a very different thing. So this is your opportunity to really add some more details or be able to convince me that this was something that was meaningful to you or that was important to you. So anyway, so if I were preparing for this question, I'd be talking about how it was really disappointing when I realized that I had failed an exam. I took some time for myself to be able to process the information, but I also recognized that I was on a time crunch. So I had to come up with a plan for what I was gonna do to remediate that examination. So I had to give myself enough time to be able to pick myself up and decide something wasn't working in my studying plan before, so I need to do something differently. So I approached my study plan differently the second time around. I reached out for help to figure out if there were other things that I could identify to be able to work harder on or to be able to highlight, if there were other ways that I could incorporate the materials so that I understood it better, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an example of how I would think about the failure question as a behavioral question. Another question that can be asked is, tell me about a time when your responsibilities got a little overwhelming. What did you do? So it's essentially asking you, like, how do you manage stress? So one example in my current life that I could talk to you about very honestly is that I have a couple of titles. One of my titles is a procedural sedation director. And very recently I had a couple of weeks in the ICU within a few weeks of each other. And during my ICU time, I know that it is a time where I'm just like 100% in ICU brain. I'm thinking about my patients constantly. That means like I go home, I check on their chart, I wake up, I wonder how they did. This is just who I am. It's also a piece of just, I think the critical care mentality is you care what's going on. You care about longer term how your decisions will influence their trajectory for your patients. And because our shifts for daytime for these 2 months that I was on, it was 7 days straight, you're just kind of like, you're 100% in it. But it means that you also get to see a lot of patients get better, which is really cool. By the way, when I say seeing patients get better, it's because I work in a surgical ICU. So I will say predominantly I work in a surgical ICU and predominantly surgical patients can get better. So it's a very different feeling than a lot of medical ICUs where patients certainly can get better as well, but it's a different patient population. So that aside, when handling this procedural sedation role, what I'll say is during my week in the ICU, I was getting all of these pages about my role in procedural sedation. I was getting a bunch of emails and it just kept coming at me on top of the stress and work that I was doing in the ICU. So initially my thought was, this has gotten to be too much. I need to reach out for help. So I'd actually gone to my boss and asked and said, maybe it's time for me to transition this role to someone else. Maybe this is kind of a sign that it's time for me to let it go. And we had a conversation about it, and he actually made another suggestion, which is, why don't you spread out the work and be able to recruit some more people? And I realized, I was like, wait a second, yeah, that's a good idea. He also had added, he said, I think it seems like you really do enjoy the policy component of it. It's just some of the day-to-day clinical questions that come up can be ill-timed or can be overwhelming depending on how your clinical schedule is. And I was like, absolutely. I think that the policy component is what impacts patient care. And that's the piece that I think is so important that I am striving for. And so as a result of that, I was able to actually recruit at least one other person, and that has already helped. It's amazing what a difference it makes. So that would be kind of the story that I would go down. I would be polishing it a bit more than me ad-libbing it on YouTube at this video. But the point is like coming up with a scenario in which you can respond to that. Another good one is like a communication behavioral one. So give me an example of a time when you had to have a difficult conversation with a frustrated colleague. How did you handle the situation? So I remember I actually got a similar question about this type of communication teamwork thing. And I remember in my interview, I actually did reference a situation where I was working with one of my colleagues in the American Medical Women's Association who is in another leadership role at my local medical school. And they were just not pulling their weight. And I had to have that difficult conversation with them about the fact that they were not doing their role and responsibilities for that particular position, and trying to figure out how do we mediate that situation? How do we move forward from that? Does it make sense for this role to continue? Is it because there's something that is going on in their life that is more acute? And being able to have that discussion. And I will say it was so challenging to find the right time to be able to frame the concerns and the questions in such a way that wasn't threatening or that wasn't attacking. And so that would be the example. I remember I had used that example when I had been asked this question about having a difficult conversation with a colleague. So definitely think about these types of questions. By the way, definitely Google behavioral questions. And I would almost say a lot of these behavioral questions are really great, almost journal prompts in a way, to be like, okay, let me just like write out some thoughts or remember a scenario so that time, anytime you get a behavioral question, you can distill it down into the base of the question, right? So that last one was about communication and teamwork. The middle one was about stress and how you deal with it. The first question was about failures and mistakes. So being able to distill down the core of the question, it will be helpful for you to be able to pick a scenario that is applicable to share with your interviewer for those types of questions. So big picture, you're gonna get a slew of questions. There's the regular category questions that most residencies will ask, and then some behavioral questions that'll come along the way. Sometimes people get asked these almost like clinical questions. So one of the questions I had seen when I was scrolling through Reddit was like, this I assume was an anesthesia interview, was tell me about an anesthesia procedure you've seen. And then the interviewee responds, or they responded epidural, and the interviewer asked, walk me through all the steps of that. So ultimately I would say that as a medical student, I expect that if you're interested in my specialty, that you have gotten some exposure to the specialty in various ways, and that you should be able to give me a very high level explanation of what you've seen. And ultimately, I'd say that the goal of that type of question is not for you to tell me about your excellent anesthesia knowledge and your procedural skills. It is to see how you handle the stress of a question like that and be able to explain the pieces of what you've seen to the interviewer. So those are some of the questions. Definitely make sure that you Google them so that you have an opportunity to reflect on them in the various ways that they're asked, because a lot of behavioral questions are really asking the same thing, but in a different way. The sixth piece of advice that I wanted to give you guys is to practice, practice, practice. So there is nothing better for interviewers than practicing with someone intimidating, practicing with a friend, practicing with your dog, whatever it is, practicing with yourself on a video camera, however you want to do it. Practice, practice, practice. You don't even have to record yourself, but I will say that's one of the techniques that I would actually recommend that you do, because it will help you recognize what are some of the things that you do. I say a lot of so's. There's a couple ums in there. There's a lot of ultimately's that are my transition words. These are the types of things that you cannot pick up on easily unless you have recorded yourself and go back and listen to it and reflect and be able to take that with you again the next time you practice. It also helps I would say to be able to figure out what the right way to come up with the answer is for yourself. So, for example, it is okay to take a moment of silence to put your thoughts together so that you can come up with a response to whatever question it is. It's not the end of the world. You do not need to fill all the space with words. So that's something too, I think that it's good to be able to practice and figure out how to calm your brain enough, especially in a very anxiety-provoking, high-stress situation of the idea of interviews. So practice makes it so that it is automatic, but then the goal is not to create a script for yourself. The goal is to be able to actually just make it feel more natural for you to respond to things. And if you've practiced on a lot of those questions I talked about earlier, or practiced distilling down the question, or even you can clarify a question with your interviewer if something doesn't make sense to you, those things are okay. So by practicing all of that, you'll find that even when you're high stress, this is something you've done. It's kind of like almost a mental memory, right? Like just like there's muscle memory, it's like a mental memory to be able to respond to things in a comfortable manner in a way that you won't be disappointing yourself later. So practice. Now you can practice with, like I said, someone super intimidating. So generally they'll have mock interviews through your medical school. Please make sure to take advantage of them. You can ask your colleagues, the other students in your class, to be able to practice it. The other thing I would say is make sure to try to practice these things in the medium that you're going to be doing it in. So the majority of anesthesia interviews are virtual. I believe they're still mostly virtual interviews across specialties. So literally going on Zoom and practicing on Zoom would probably be the best way to do it. The other thing I alluded to earlier was recording yourself. So either you go on Zoom with your friend and you guys go back and forth in terms of like, okay, one person takes a turn being interviewer and one is the interviewee, and then you swap, and then you record it and be able to go through it yourself. You can see what are the things that you're doing. I personally know that when I am thinking about things, I'm gonna look elsewhere, right? I'm like literally looking elsewhere. Is that something you wanna be doing on your interview? It's fine if it is, but the point is being able to recognize some of the things you are doing, and then being able to see, okay, if you had stumbled with something, what was it that caused you to stumble, so that in the future, if you encounter that again, you have ways to be able to manage the situation. So those are some of the things I think that are so important about recording. I recognize that it's really uncomfortable to listen to yourself. I have to do that when I do these YouTube videos, right? Like I'm like literally on my computer listening to myself over and over and over again, like to listen to your voice and be able to cut things out. Oh my gosh, but you get used to it. So this is something where you only go through the match once, hopefully, right? The most important thing is your goal is to only go through the match one time and to avoid the soap. And if that is your goal, this is a small investment for a very big return. So please practice, record yourself, get feedback, honest feedback, right? Don't do this with someone that's just gonna sugarcoat and say, you're amazing. No, this is not the time for that. This is the time for you to keep an open mind and recognize that in any situation, in anything we work on, you can always do better. You can always improve. So you want someone that's actually gonna coach you through it. So getting honest feedback and being able to use that feedback and be able to continue building on your own skills for your interview will be key. So practice. And finally, the last piece of advice I wanted to give all of you guys is pertaining to the virtual interview process. So one of the things that I noticed when so I run a summer program that's called the Virtual Pre-Op Program, and I have fourth year medical students join in on Zoom with me to do kind of a pre-op scenario in a virtual setting. So we give you a scenario and you prepare an anesthetic plan and you pretend that you're pre-opping with your attending the night before surgery so that you can discuss that plan that you came up with. One of the things I've noticed is there are super varying ways that people have set up their Zoom. What you don't want to happen is a technological fail on the day of your interview. So there's so many things, unfortunately, with technology that can go wrong. So I think it is super important to figure out what setting are you going to be doing your interview in? Is that in your house? Is that in a dedicated room at the medical school? How is this gonna look? in that setting, I will say that your background could be a way for us to ask questions. I remember I interviewed someone where they had like a guitar in their background. We're like, oh, that's so cool. Do you play, right? Like, or someone had some cute little plants and I'm like, oh, are you able to keep a plant alive? I mostly can. I'm better at keeping humans alive, I promise. But, you know, things like that can inspire questions. So if there is something you want to guide someone to, if you really love reading books, you could put a couple books that you love up there. Things like that can help direct some of the conversation during interviews. The other piece I'll say is that personally, during work calls now, I use a virtual background, but during my interviews, I never used a virtual background because of the fact that I never wanted to have my computer memory be so taken up by trying to process the virtual background that it wasn't able to handle the whole Zoom situation, the whole Zoom like program. Because the virtual background takes quite a bit of processing power. So what I did instead is I went on Amazon and I bought one of those kind of like room dividers and put that behind me, because that way I didn't have to use a virtual background, but I had an aesthetically pleasing background behind me. I will say that's something I did more recently. For my actual medical school or my actual residency interviews, I was in person, but more recently when I have done interviews as an interviewee, I had in the past had just a white background behind me so that it was just that. That's what I've used before, but more recently I have bought a room divider, so I'll use that as my background for interviews. So not using the virtual background can be really nice to free up space on your computer so that your computer can process your audio. Audio is super important. A piece of advice that I give a lot of my applicants or mentees is that you need to invest in your audio, because that's something that I can hear, right? At the end of the day, like, yes, the video component is important, being able to see body language, being able to see how you respond. I think that's a great component of the whole process, but also I need to be able to hear you clearly. So oftentimes Bluetooth headphones do not transmit as well as an actual wired microphone. So I bought one of those Yeti microphones at the beginning of the pandemic when I was doing all of these virtual conferences and giving presentations and running things, and it has made a world of a difference for your audio. So especially if you're doing recordings of yourself, you can hear how your audio is, and you can tell, oh, is it actually kind of hard to hear me when I'm speaking using this or that, and be able to test those things out. So audio is super, super important. The other thing is your connectivity. So if you're at school, you're probably going to be able to use the network that is at school, which will be really, really high speed, and it should be relatively reliable. But the other piece is making sure that you have backup plans for things. So one of the things I did when I was running a really big meeting that was virtual was that I actually bought an Ethernet cable, because an Ethernet cable directly into your modem is going to be the most reliable connection you can get, as opposed to relying on the Wi-Fi part. So that's something I did. I actually bought like a really, really long one because I was far away. My computer was kind of far away from the box that was my router for my network. And so that being said, it worked out for what I needed, and it was the most reliable internet I had ever had. Nowadays, with a lot of laptops, you have to buy like an adapter to be able to use the Ethernet cable, but just some things to think about making sure you have stable internet. Ultimately, most virtual interview types of setups, most programs will say, oh, if our connection were to fail or were to break off for some reason, here's my cell phone number, you can call me, we can finish the interview over the phone. So making sure you're in a place that has service or some way to get service would also be really important. So it's so important, I think, in this virtual era to actually think about your technology and test it out and make sure it works, because on the virtual calls, I have noticed really interesting backgrounds, a lot of distracting noises around, sometimes really unstable connections. And then sometimes I literally cannot just hear or anything, like I cannot hear the words that you're saying. And so for an interview, you do not want that to happen, for sure. Okay, I feel like those were a lot of tips. This has become a very long video. I hope this was really helpful. If you made it to this point, thank you so much. And please give me a thumbs up if it was a helpful video. Comment below if there's specific follow-ups you want. If you want me to do a question and answer about the interview process, I'll drop a couple links to things that I had referenced that I talked about for the technology piece of it, as well as my blog entry on some virtual interview tips and things about adjusting where your stuff is. And then let me know, like I said, if there's anything that you want me to cover in a future video, keep me posted. Okay, Oh, I'm supposed to tell you to subscribe to my channel if you want to hear more from me. I will see you guys next time. Bye.